Introduction to Un crimen chiamato libertà. For some time now, a renewed interest in everything that relates to prison and the living conditions inside it has been spreading within the so-called movement. Bulletins, websites, committees, actions, and initiatives of struggle flourish. Beyond motives that are more contingent, such as judiciary investigations and arrests, and those that are political, often due to the lack of any projectuality through which to experiment with understandings and find accomplices, all that remains for comrades to share is the misfortune of prison, reducing differences to zero. The main reason why the anti-prison critique rouses such sincere attention is quite simple, almost a banality. It is easier and easier for anyone to get locked up within the walls of a prison. And not only due to a generalized repressive response that the state might make to the radicalization and growth of social struggles, since this is the outcome of the same social, economic, and technological progress that manifests itself under this disquieting paradox. We could all end up in prison again because we already live in a prison. Nobody excluded. We could all end up in prison. The triumph of this society of money has caused the living conditions of millions of people to deteriorate. This throws them into a situation of precariousness, where only worsening conditions await them. It destroys certainties capable of giving any measure of meaning to existence on this earth. It undoes every social link that is not economic. It arouses desperation, anxiety, and rage. In the past, the coldness of an empty heart was partially compensated by the torpor of a full belly. Today, such an illusion can no longer be put forward. Growing emotional and material poverty has isolated the individual in the corner to which the process of social reproduction confines him. In such a situation, it is no accident if more and more people demand to participate in the only existing community, that of capital, in the only way that is conceivable to do so, that of commodity consumption. The siren of advertising never sleeps, and it invites everyone to consume more, and more. And one can easily imagine what happens when those who are nothing and possess nothing are incited without interruption to have, with the aim of appearing. They stretch out their hands, tread on people's toes, have no regard for anyone. As if this were not enough, the institutional ambition of forestalling every possible way of escape from a world that is sold to us as the best possible has led to the criminalization of any behavior other than that of blind acceptance and defense of the social order, with all its rules, laws, and morals. In its presumption of regulating and codifying every impulse and every human passion to safeguard the peace of the marketplaces and streets, the law has expanded the field of illegality considerably, creating many new crimes, and thus new criminals, new future prisoners. This is what has provoked the need for more police, more judges, and more prisons in a notorious vicious circle that feeds upon itself. It is now sufficient to merely breathe without order to incur the risks of being locked up inside four walls. We all live in prison already. In the course of the last few years, the physical structure of the prison has been moved farther and farther from our eyes, into those outskirts where its gloomy presence doesn't end up darkening the gaudy windows of the municipal center, but fits in perfectly with the squalor of those outskirts. At the same time, its shadow has started to weigh down more and more over all of us without leaving us alone for a moment. The merit, if it can be called this, is in the introduction of new technologies that have allowed an unimaginable leap forward into the sphere of social control. As with every other technological innovation, the technologies of surveillance, which were tested in prison in order to keep the most riotous prisoners at bay, have found a civil application. After all, security inside the prisons begins with security outside the walls. This explains the startling number of video cameras found in every corner of our cities, and even inside buses and trains. The obligatory routes we are forced to take for our movements, the magnetic detectors that inspect us at the exits of many businesses, the identification codes that replace our individuality, the innumerable prohibitions that it is necessary to respect, as well as the variegated crowd of guardians put in place to safeguard the world. In short, all of these things that plague our existence. Thanks to the new identification cards, we will not have to be arrested anymore in order to supply our fingerprints. Since we are all potential criminals, we are all treated as such. Step by step, the entire society is becoming a huge open-air prison from which it is impossible to escape. Aside from realizing the worst totalitarian nightmare, the one that doesn't even need to send armored cars or patrols of soldiers into the streets, because it has partially replaced them with tiny, less visible technological prostheses. All of this obscures the difference that exists between those who find themselves behind the bars. Obscures it to such an extent that the very notion of freedom becomes merely a nebulous gradation and, on the other hand, submission to coercion becomes precise, scientific, concrete, and above all, normal. As a contribution to the struggle against the prison society, we have decided to publish this collection of texts that the group Os Cangaceiros distributed in France. This activity of theirs, that lasted from approximately 1984 to the early 1990s, was important because it managed not to limit itself to expressing a merely theoretical critique of the existent, but maintained and spread a consequent practical critique. Named after the Brazilian outlaws who robbed rich property holders while ridiculing the police in the late 19th century, Os Cangaceiros was born and developed in a sphere that starts from social delinquency and flows directly into revolutionary action. We recall that France is the homeland of the various mandarins, lacenaires, messarines. They were authors of a self-named magazine of which only 3 issues were published. These were rich in analyses and documentation about the violence of the French periphery and the strikes unleashed to resist the industrial restructuring that was then going on, as well as about uprisings that occurred in other countries like Spain, Great Britain, or South Africa. They published flyers and manifestos that stood out due to the unusual positions they took. We recall the one in defense of soccer hooligans after the Hazel tragedy occurred in 1985. They were also the authors of 2 books, a broad anthology of writings about millenarianism, and a diary about a fatal disease that struck one of them. Footnote: this book is available in English with the title Andrea, One Woman's Fight to Die Her Own Way, from Eberhardt Press, also available on Resonance Audio Distro. And they published a dossier on the new prisons that were being built on French soil. After observing that, quote, delinquency at the beginning of the 1970s expressed a desire for freedom, a wild turn, a game of bands, unquote, and how this criminal freedom was brought to an end in the very early 1980s as a result of extremely hard police repression and the blackmail imposed by the reign of necessity, to Os Cangaceiros. All that remained was to take note of the end of an epoch of thoughtlessness and to prepare for the advent of an epoch of desperation, marked by the return of the quote-unquote dangerous class to the most uncontrolled rage. Quote, we talk constantly about violence. It is our element, and we could even say our daily destiny. Violence is first of all the conditions imposed on us, the police defense of them, and, unfortunately more rarely, that which we throw back in their faces. End quote. More gravediggers of the old world than builders of the new one, closer to the poor and their explosions of violence than to a working class that is ideologically assigned a redemptive historical mission. Os Cangaceiros have endeavored to give voice and reason to the refusal of all the conditions of existence, even when this refusal might assume especially ferocious forms, with an awareness that certainly couldn't come from any political militancy, towards which they have always exhibited the greatest contempt, but rather from a genuine dimension of life outside the law, claimed with pride. In short, these were social outlaws, some of whom had already been convicted of common crimes, all perpetually at risk of being given a hospitality in homeland prisons. With such a premise, it is needless to say that the prisons found declared enemies, while prisoners found loyal accomplices in Os Cangaceiros. The revolts that broke out in May 1985 in several French prisons provided them with the occasion for demonstrating this. A month later, in June, Os Cangaceiros claimed the act of sabotage against some installations of the National Association of the French Railroad in Châtelet-en-Brie. The burning of the tracks of the Nantes-Paris rail line with tires and straw, and the blockade of the Paris-Brussels trains, the carriages of which were covered with graffiti in favor of prisoners' struggles. As often happens in these cases, also due to the simplicity of the methods used, the idea made headway and started to spread throughout the country. Within a very few weeks, the railroad became the main target for actions of solidarity with the prisoners. Aim was also taken at printing works where some newspapers were printed, at the metro, at the cars of some state functionaries, at a company that exploited penitentiary labor, at cars of the Tour de France. Many of these actions remained anonymous or were claimed by other groups, such as the support groups of the imprisoned rebels, the Friends of Rebellious Prisoners, the Railroad Hooligans, the Support Committee for the Prisoners, Los Bandoleros, etc. The national press, prey to panic, ran for cover, evoking the specter of terrorism and denouncing the mysterious group that was supposed to have been behind all these actions. For their part, Os Cangaceiros contemptuously rejected every connection between themselves and a quote-unquote terrorism. This is a term that they will use without the least trace of embarrassment to indicate the violence of various political armed groups. Something so much stranger if one considers that they profess themselves to be enemies of the language of the state, in which they saw nothing but the continuation of politics by other means, a typical expression of gauchista impotence. Gauchista is Italian for leftist. Their violence was of a very different nature since, as they explained, quote, "Our tools of action are those that any proletarian uses, sabotage and vandalism. We don't do symbolic actions. We create disorder, as workers in struggle commonly know how to do when they blockade roads and railroads, sabotage materials, television transmitters, etc. Nothing to do with the armed struggle fetishism so dear to the militants of various combatant organizations." 4 years later, in 1989, Os Cangaceiros took a further step forward in the battle against the prison institution. From active solidarity with prisoners, they would go on to direct struggles against the construction of the new incarceration facilities. This time, the so-called Program of the 13,000 would provide them with the opportunity. This was an ambitious project that the government launched to completely reorganize the French penitentiary system, a project that foresaw the closing of the oldest and least adequate institution, the restructuring of others, and the construction of new, more modern prisons, all under the banner of absolute security to be obtained through massive employment of new technologies capable of constantly controlling the prisoner in each of his movements in a discreet and aseptic way. The declared aim was to create 13,000 new spaces for prisoners, from which the program derives its name, in order to alleviate overcrowding. The real one was to put the screws to those locked up inside the prisons and to support the mania for justice that was spreading in broad sections of society. Os Cangaceiros considered taking up the challenge launched by the French government and, starting in April 1989, began a long campaign of sabotage at the construction sites of the prisons that were being built, along with thefts of blueprints of the buildings at the expense of the municipalities and the devastation of the offices of public labor firms that had obtained the contracts. Among the many actions spread throughout the national territory that, despite being censored by the national press in the instance, were able to inspire other lovers of freedom, we want to recall the lessons taught to the architect Christian de Monchi, who was responsible for the construction of various prisons, on the public path. After more than a year of sabotage, Os Cangaceiros obtained 10,000 addresses of residents in the vicinity of future prisons to whom they sent extracts of a voluminous dossier containing dates and information, fruit of their visits to the locales of enterprises involved in the foul affair, about the institutions of punishment that were being built. In November 1990, the complete dossier, 13,000 Belles, 13,000 Escapes, finally came out. Its distribution provoked thousands of polemics and the ire of the French government, following the publication of various excerpts in newspapers of national circulation. Among other things, the dossier contains accurate technical documentation about the many prisons under construction or in the process of being restructured, with general outlines, information about materials used, fixtures, controls of access, doors and locks, electric and hydraulic systems, sanitation, roofing, and external installations. And above all, there are detailed little maps of every building and its particulars. The police, who had already begun to intensify their efforts to neutralize Os Cangaceiros in the summer of 1987, perhaps causing in this way the interruption of the group's quote-unquote public activity, carried out searches in French subversive circles. It seems that the mere possession of 13,000 Belles was sufficient to bring one under investigation, and even the editors of the journal Mordicus, who had dared to publish some excerpts from the dossier, had their legal troubles. In any case, it turns out that no one has ever been tried and condemned for the actions attributed to Os Cangaceiros, who vanished into nothing in the early 1990s. In this booklet, we have collected some of the texts appearing in the second number of their magazine, published in November 1985, about the French prisoners' revolt of May 1985, and the actions of solidarity with them that have developed in the following months. Then we have added other texts from the dossier 13,000 Belles, among them the chronology of actions carried out against the Program of the 13,000, between 1989 and 1990, along with the letters that Os Cangaceiros sent to their quote-unquote victims, claiming the actions, the introduction of the dossier, and the letter that accompanied its mailing. With no intention whatsoever of putting forth a new militant position, we hope that reading these texts can furnish ideas for reflection about possible and practical anti-political prospects for a struggle against the prison institution that is impossible to conceive apart from a struggle against the society that hosts it.
Des balles chauffées à blanc circulent en rang, tuerai pour en France, à cause de qui pourra encore se surpasser du mécontentement, je n'ai plus rien à perdre, si ce n'est moi.